Patapu ke awhio ai o toa. I o tau ngahi lau maalie kono tempale. Pepe foki ki ho tau loto lotonga. Patapu pea mo e whanau mo makapuna ho eiki. A matapure. Kau tau hilotu. Pe moki mo tolu ko toa pesi ka inga aku mo whanongo mai he hoa ko eni. Atoki ha whakatapu ma ke he eni pea ma toa tā Siale Foliaki oku ma kau ngā kau he hoa ko eni. Ki he tala noa whekau aki pia moeanga e tauhi whanau he rolotonga ko eni o e lockdown pe ko e whetaputapui ko eni.
Malo ilo Maria Reverend Saane.
Yeah.
Malo ki o tua, mai whanga Maria koni. Ko le pe ke uwhanga whakatapu. Ko whiawhia he whiawhine ke tatala noa whekawaki mo mea maho inga koni.
Yeah. Malo a peto Siale, te pima ke whahata lotu.
Iyo.
E ka mata ke ta pol kalama, ke ta lotu. O tua aku mau whawhetai atu ki he a Fiona i he hoa ko eni. He whakakoloa mo e tāpu aki. O ki hanga whakainasi aki ki mautolu. Mau hanga atu ki a Fiona he koe tauhi whanau, koe whanau ia ai a Fiona. A ko i mua ki mautolu e o tua. I he poto whaka o tua. Ke whai e whainasi aki ko eni. Mo e kāinga whanonga ko toa pē ke aonga. Ai tānaki pia mo e tūtui ai koloa whaka o tua ko eni. Koe mauloa tuia pia mo e hū. Ia klais ko alo ko mau whamo ui. Amen.
Amen. Malo Saane.
Hello, Siale, and a very warm welcome to all our listeners at this time. I'd like to acknowledge, before further ado, I'd like to acknowledge Foundation North for funding this program and enable Langima'a Oceania Counseling Service to be able to bring in and interview professionals as well as people from different walks of life that have great experience in parenting, so that they could share with us their insights and their knowledge on parenting during lockdown. So Siale, I would like to please just ask yourself that, please, can you introduce yourself for our audience?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Saane. And I know that our conversation this evening is going out to our Pacific community, so we'll be, speaking in English to one another, which is great for me because even though, my Tongan is good, but in these more formal settings, sometimes I feel very nervous. So, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody in English. And just a very brief introduction for myself. My father was the Siale Foliaki. He was a medical doctor that trained in the 1940s, and so was one of the very few, as that generation of young doctors that came, that Tonga produced, one of the very few of that generation. And my family traveled here to New Zealand in 1969. I'm the youngest of 7 children, and my father stayed behind in Tonga. And so we came here, and I think that my parents underestimated the impact that traveling away to New Zealand would have on my mother. And I think it was a difficult time for us as a family. And I had the experience of growing up, and I think my mother was, if I was to put my medical hat on and talk as a doctor, I think that my mother had significant psychological challenges readjusting to life here in New Zealand. And it was a difficult time for her. And, we're going to talk about parenting, but I think one of the things that we should talk about is how difficult it is to parent when there are pressures on, external pressures on both mothers and fathers, external pressures that make it difficult for them to be able to parent to the standard of the quality that they would like. And then, I grew up here. Well, actually, I was wanting to be a Catholic priest, Simon. When I was going through school, I thought, my family are Catholic, and I guess it's a call that Tongans, I think the Pacific community, we feel very deeply. because it's a form of service, isn't it? You know, when you become a whaiwhekau, it was always going to be an act of service. But you know, my father wanted me to go to medical school, and I chose to go to medical school. When I finished medical school, psychiatry was a profession that was very close to those feelings that we have as human beings of wanting to help others by building a relationship with others. And then I trained as a psychiatrist, and then I realized in my training, when I finished my training, that often by the time they got to adult services, often the changes that we could have made if we got involved in their lives at a younger stage. And so I retrained as a child psychiatrist. And I've spent all my life working at Minimal Hospital within our community. It's probably the right place for me to be, given the fact that I'm a Pacific Island doctor. It's the right place for me to do my work, and I'm very happy to be here tonight with you.
Yeah. So in saying that, it is a privilege and honor for me personally, as well as for Langima'a, Siale, to have you on board, because it is a difficult time in our journey. Not to say that the other times we are not difficult in our journey. Just listening to your story about the underestimations of the impact on the children as well as on the parents, the whole story of migration. So me listening to your story, I'm a first generations migrating here to New Zealand. And you saying that you're comfortable speaking in English, it's not my first language, so it's not my comfort zone. But again, it's a spaces where we have to survive. And so many hurdles and obstacles that we have to overcome as an individual, let alone thinking of parents, on how much they have to cope with in their parenting. And in saying that, Siale, I'm just asking you the first question now. From a cultural perspective, what differences do you see in our traditional way of raising children compared with what is considered good parenting here in New Zealand's context? And do you think that these differences in cultural approaches is having a detrimental effect on Pacific children?
Yeah, it's such an important question, because if I speak to my personal experience before I talk about my professional understanding of parenting, Saane, when we grew up, we had very strong cultural values within our family. Even though all of us were born in Tonga, but we came here, all of us children. I was only 2 years old when we arrived. But if you think about little things, my sister's room was, oh, sorry, I keep trying to. So I'll give an example. If my sister was watching television, the rest of us boys, we wouldn't watch television with my sister. Do you know, if my father was watching television, if we wanted to, we wouldn't sit with him. We would sit separately to him. When the chief of our village, when Whakawhanua came to visit us, all of us, including my father, we would sit on the ground. Yeah. And so there are these cultural demonstrations of respect that are profound to us. And we watch not only the way that we demonstrate respect to our parents, but then our parents demonstrated respect to people within our culture that were held what we would consider were higher in our hierarchy of status. And so from a very young age, you absorb these lessons of the importance of respect and the importance of language. Yeah, we would never swear. And when you grow up in a community, you hear the way that other children interact with grown-ups. There were some traditional methods, and the way that we would dress, when we left the home. These important cultural considerations, I think, helped us to navigate relationships within a Tongan context. But what found it hard, and I think that each generation is finding hard, is when we were outside of our very Tongan context, some of the normal behavior that we saw within our community, other children and other families didn't conduct themselves in that way. And it's not necessarily that Tongan culture is right or Tongan culture is wrong. It's just the nature of our culture taught us certain things. And the discipline that we received, when we broke any of the rules that we were brought up to live by, the punishment was from a Palangi perspective, we would consider it physical discipline, but in another culture could look at that same discipline and call that physical abuse. And now that I'm older and I look back on our parenting, I truly believe what I'm going to say next, Saane. I don't really believe you need to use physical punishment. Do you know what I mean? So when you look at, and we grew up in big Tongan families, yeah, and there are some Tongan families that use discipline quite severely and quite a lot, but there are other Tongan families that use very little physical discipline, yeah. And what I've noticed is the families, even within our Tongan culture, the families that use very little physical discipline, often they're very close. You know, often it's those families that have that take the opportunity to spend time together, or a lot of family, you know, they have, and there's good routines and good structures in the children's lives. Because when we go on to talk about parenting, some of those things that I see other cultures and some of the things that I see within our own culture, the good things, they start to look alike across cultures. Yeah.
Thank you, Siale. That brings me to actually ask you the next questions, which when you reflect on your own approach,
yes,
and this is from a personal and professional approach,
yep.
What weaknesses do you see in your own parenting? And what would you change if you had another chance?
Yeah, that's right.
Do it again.
That's right. That's right. I have a very simple answer for that. I grew up in a family where the expectations were very high on us. Yep. And the expectation was unspoken. And often the expectation that we placed on ourselves, I'm not too sure whether or not my parents wanted us as children to be stressed by the expectation. But there was a strong expectation. The expectation was mainly education, that we would do well at school, and that as a result of doing well in the school, we would get good jobs, that we would help our family, and we would help our community. Yeah, it was a value that I think we all share that. And if I could change my parenting, because I parented my children like that when they were very little, if I could change something about that, what I truly know now is that happy children do very well. Happy children do well at school. Happy children enjoy sport. Happy children are much more likely to behave well for their parents. Yes. And I would put more emphasis as a parent on interacting with my children and leaving them feeling happy about who they are. Rather than the way that I was interacting with my children, it was harsh. It was, I don't think my father was a harsh man, but if you think about when he was growing up as a child, he was born in Tonga in 1924. Okay? And so you think about the generation of Tongans. Okay? Children were seen, but you really, when the adults were around, we were silent. And this notion, you know, our children, I'm sure, you know, if you think about your young boys, they're growing up, they're getting good education, they're going to good schools. They're taught at the school to ask questions. They're taught at school to that their opinion matters. And I know that we're both going to laugh, but when I was a child, my opinion didn't matter. Do you know what I mean? And if I spoke out of turn, my older siblings would tell me to be quiet. Do you know what I mean? It wouldn't be, my mother and father didn't do a lot of parenting, which is a funny thing. My sister and my older siblings, they did a lot of the parenting. They would tell me what was right and wrong well before my mother or father, you know, before they did any teaching. I often learned what needed to be learned from our parenting, from my elder siblings. And so what I'm saying is, times have changed. And I think we have to adapt. Yeah, our parenting has to adapt. I really believe that, like I said earlier, our responsibility, happy children do well, and happy children respond well, and they don't misbehave as often as children that are not happy. So my emphasis on parenting has changed. And I know that when I get a chance to be a grandparent, my children are all adults now, and I'm looking forward to being a grandparent. My parenting will be softer and gentler and kinder. And I think that it's a lovely thing to be able to talk about these things, because I truly believe that.
Yeah. One of the things that I've realized, it's a great insight that you said that happy children do better.
For you.
There will be something that you are hoping that if you could have another chance to parent your children again, there will be something that you will implement.
Yes.
But now you're looking forward for your grandchildren. That you will be implementing that in your grandchildren, for them to be happier, in you approaching them in their preparations for school and life in general. But there will be another challenge, don't you think, Doctor? Another challenge in facing your own children, whom they will probably carrying out your own parenting style in their life.
That's right.
It's like you coming against an old version of yourself.
That's right.
Does it sound like it?
And I think each generation goes through it. So if you think about Saane, if you think about when you were young, and I think about my grandmother and my grandfather, when we were disciplined, it was always my grandmother that was saying, stop, she was always defending us.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I think each generation, we take on the characteristics of being a grandparent. But when I look at children growing up in New Zealand, one of the things that strike me when I go back home, the thing that immediately strikes me is the smiles on the children's faces when we go back to Tonga. And they're naughty too, like there's sometimes, you're driving down the road and a child walks across the road. They, instead of rushing across the road to get to the other side, they slow down and they make you have to wait for them. The Tongan children are funny. They've got a good sense of humor. It's one of the things that I noticed about going home. And they're cheeky, but always on the right side of cheeky. You know what I mean? They're respectful cheeky. But I noticed that the children here, they're not quite as open that way. They're not quite as... If you walk around the streets of South Auckland and you see the children, it isn't that same happiness. And I know that is growing up in this modern environment, in this urban setting, I know that it makes there's a much more pressure on the minds of children. And I think that parenting here in this context is much more challenging because it's much more individual parenting. When I think about what happens at home, there's a much more collective approach to the parenting of all the children. All of the children feel like they belong. Whereas in New Zealand, I don't think there is that same collective approach to the care of young people. It's much more individualistic. Each family is doing their own individual parenting, not so much that collective parenting that we grew up with.
That's a very also interesting insight of the collective parenting and the individual parenting.
Yes.
We do have good relationship with our neighbor.
Yes.
But the funny thing is that we've been in this address since 2018.
Yes.
So a few years now. I'm still not comfortable for my kids to go and play at the neighbor's playground.
Yeah.
So, and if they can go, I will probably allow them like for an hour or two, and I would like them to come back home.
Yep.
I still feel that I don't know them enough to trust them.
Yes.
In comparison, if I was probably back at home in Tonga, in Soko, these are the neighbors that I grew up with them all my life.
Yes.
Their grandparents grew up with my grandparents, their parents grew up with my parents.
Yes.
So that genealogy of connections build trust that enables me to allow my kids even to run there and ask them if we could have some salt or some sugar.
But if you think one of the attributes of, if you want, the research on happiness, there are these different attributes that the research says, if you compare people that are happy and you compare people that are unhappy, then there are certain attributes that stand out. And one of the things you're describing is if we parent well, our children are much more trusting and they're much more open. Yeah. Yes. But like you're describing, in an environment where we're uncertain as to whether our children will be safe in a different environment, with different families or different around the neighborhood, we tend to keep the children close, which means they have less interactions with other adults that they could have learned something from, and open up other relationships that they can learn from, that builds that attribute of being open. Yeah. Okay? And then people that are very cautious and very suspicious or very closed, those people, it's much harder for them to experience happiness. And so as parents, how do we find that balance between keeping our children safe, but also ensuring that they're open to other experiences and other relationships so that they're trusting, because that is one of the attributes that leads to people having happy lives.
And that actually leads me to my next question, Doctor. At both personal and professional level, what advice would you have for parents regarding building a healthy relationships and communicating with their children during lockdown? Now that they don't just do an individual parenting because they choose to, now the law have said to them, you must do so. So they have no choice over that. So in that regard, what would you say for them? How would they build their relationship, healthy relationship with one another and communicating during this time?
You know, one of the things about healthy relationships is it's something to do with connecting with your children. Yeah? And so, because you know, the advice that I'm going to give, if I think about my own family situation, it's not really what happened in my family. So I'm going to, and it makes it a little bit funny, but I hope it's still serious at the same time. So if you think about healthy relationship, there's an element of play. Okay? So, you know, really, if you watch a father play with their child, whether it's kicking a ball or they're playing a card game or they're sitting together watching a movie, it's always a joyful, it leaves us all feeling good inside. You know, if you see a father and son, you know, the child might only be 6 years old, but if you see them holding hands and walking in the park, it lifts all of our spirits, right? But my father wasn't that type of person. And in Tongan culture, if you watch this together, all the Tongans would think, yeah, that's an appropriate interaction. You know, if we were interacting, my father would never play. Yeah, he was a very serious man. And my brothers would play and we would play. He would be sitting there, yeah, you know, they'd be sitting on the grass and we'd be out the back and all the children would be playing. My father would just sit quietly. And then you've got to ask the question, did we have a healthy relationship with my father? And the answer is yes, because there are different types of parenting. What we want from our parents is we want them to be consistent. Okay? We want them to be reliable. Yeah, we want them to be authentic and sincere. My father was all those things, but he was a quiet man. And you know, often I would want him to talk and share what he was thinking, but he wouldn't ever do that. The only time we heard what he was thinking was the time of whai maolotu. When he would pray, he would talk about the things that were important to him, and he would be grateful in his prayer to the blessings that we had received as a family. And he always asked God's blessing on the rest of our family. And he would often talk about his family in prayer. But then after the prayer, you wouldn't hear another sentence from him. You know, 4 hours could go by. If you spent time with him for 4 hours, he could sit there and not say anything at all. Whereas my mother was the complete opposite. My mother was, I take after my mother, because if you were interviewing my father, I think he would be a very different type of interview. My mum used to talk a lot and she used to laugh a lot, and it, you know, brought a lot of joy to us. But then you asked me a question, because the question is deeper than just the ability to connect through play, because you would say that healthy relationships are built on having some fun. Okay? But it's deeper than that. Healthy relationships is often about role modeling other aspects of what can make us secure. So a healthy relationship is a relationship where a child is made to feel secure in that relationship. My father's constantness, he was constant. He was quiet, but he was constant. He was always the same. And that makes children feel safe. He was a reliable person. You know, he wouldn't not come home at nighttime. He wouldn't not be there on the weekend. Do you know what I mean? And you know you better get up on time to go to church, because he would, well, if my father walked in and said to us once, you'll ask at 9:30, the 10 o'clock mass. If my father came in to ask us twice, he wouldn't ask twice. The second time he appeared, that was risky for us as children because we were going to be disciplined. But that should we feel fearful or should we feel safe? because my father was so constant and so consistent, he woke you up once, he won't wake you up twice. And because we knew that, actually, I would say that that is very positive parenting, because we knew what his expectations were. They were always clear to us. There was never any confusion around my father. And I think human beings, and particularly children, they love certainty. They don't like confusion. And when I think about your 4 sons, I know that you and Benny are able to provide that certainty. You know, that your values, they know what your values are, and they know that your approach to discipline. And because you are constant in that, I think that, yeah.
Thank you, Siale. I like the concept of play.
Yes, I do too.
Because like when you were talking, I remember, because you know how my dad passed away when I was 3 years old. And I can relate to the concept when you say your father was constant. That his presence provides security, whether he will say anything or not.
Yes.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things with us Pacific Islanders is our non-verbal communication.
Yes.
Despite the fact he may say like no words, all the children knows what is supposed to be, what's the meaning of that silence, you know, what are you supposed to do at what time. And that's usually come down, we have a concept that tahanofo no laine, meaning you stay in your own lane, which everyone is associated with responsibility and obligations. It's like your father have a responsibility and obligations, that's his lane. Children have their responsibilities and their obligations, that's their lane. But the communications in between, sometimes it's not verbal, but then it's still understood by each side. And the constants that provides security to the children, it's very vital. Which means for me growing up, that did not happen because I didn't have a father figure. But I've just remembered now, and this is kind of funny to me, because at teenage, late teen to the early 20s, I used to go around the Pacific with the Scripture Union. And I was usually part of, we were doing action song and acting and different dramas. And I was one of the best actor. But I was remembering, where did I get that acting from? But I remember back in my childhood, my mother used to be like very tired and look very sad. And I reflected back now and realized that it was her grieving for the loss of my father. And also her own grief because she lost my eldest brother when my eldest brother was 6. So she lost her mother when her mother gave birth to my mom. So my mom had a lot of grief in her life. So, but that's not to say that she was actually like an outgoing woman and had a great laugh. But there were times when she came home, you see the sadness in her face. And for me, I know the things that like frustrated my mom when she goes to, and she was a person that couldn't really speak her mind. So she already drew a conclusion that her opinion doesn't really matter. And my mom was not so educated and she was a domestic mom. But when dad passed away, she has to go and work. But what happened? So when I see the sadness in mom, I as a child usually dressed up in different characters. I dressed up in different characters and I would come, it's like I'm performing a drama, solo performing to mom, you know, and I'll be wearing like different clothes and acting different voices and mom would be cracking up laughing. And I remember one day my auntie came home, came to visit us. She came from New Zealand and I saw her walking from afar coming towards our house. But me and mom and my second brother, were doing all this acting. And mom would be our audience laughing and we were laughing and doing all the acting at the same time. When our auntie arrived, because she came from New Zealand, and she knocked at the door, and when we opened the door, and she said, "Oh, it's just the 3 of you." And we said, "Yes, just the 3 of us." And she said, "When I walked from afar, I heard the laugh. I thought that you have guessed." But it's very interesting because the whole playful concept, it's one of the best memories of happiness that I remember in childhood.
And can I make the comment, Saane? Do you think as children, we underestimate how much the children understand what it is as parents that we need? You know, if we really pay attention, often our children will respond to us in ways that can lift our spirits when we need them to.
Yeah. But also one of the things that I was thinking of, Siale, sometimes the parents actually hide their feelings. Like my mom would do that. She would hide her grief, she'll hide her pain from us. But we read it, we saw it, we knew it.
That's right.
And I did not know where did we get it from, but you know, we didn't agree with her. We ended up entertaining her to bring a laugh into the space. Because if she would probably share with us her grief, we probably don't know how to respond to that. Or we'll probably cry with her. Yeah, so that actually brings us into our next question, Doctor.
Yes.
Is there any advice on parents, on what parents might do to help a child experiencing anxiety, low mood, or disrespectful behavior? What would be an advice for the parents on what to do with children like that?
It's funny because, you know, going back to the conversation we just had, I think you as a child experienced that there was something that you could do that could lift the spirits of your mum.
Yeah.
And I think that that human quality, I think we all have it, of all age groups. We have that quality of understanding what another human being needs from us. And when we think about when a child is feeling anxious and feeling depressed, often those are signs of a child not feeling secure. That is a sign that I think is a signal to us. You know, it could be a signal to a family unit that there is something going on that needs to be addressed. And it's a really difficult conversation for us to have, Saane, because a lot of the children are growing up now in households where there is tension in the household. Because I don't think you're going to experience a young child in particular being anxious, for no reason. And then, you know, what's hard for us as parents is that often the children are a thermometer, for the temperature of stress that the adults are experiencing, and they're trying to communicate something to us. And one of the most dangerous things that we can do as adults is to blame the child. You know, so for example, if a child is feeling anxious, there is something about, there might be a level of distress or stress going on. And you know, as adults, we know what the types of things are. And sometimes they can be difficult things that families have to navigate. But at other times, it can be just a household where there's a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. And the parents they're not as connected, they're not as available, they're having emotional difficulties themselves, and therefore not being able to make the child feel safe. I think those are kind of my opening comments. But we could, I know we've got a limited time together tonight. That's a really deep question, and it's hard to know how deep to go into the question.
It's because it's, I think this is my view into it, that probably some of the parents, especially for their teenagers, are probably like not talking to the parents. They lock themselves in their room. They're not communicating, and the parents are probably, because they don't know how to cope. They don't know how to parent. And the teenager will probably continue to say, but you don't understand. You don't understand what I feel. You don't understand this. And the parents struggle to engage and to build a relationship.
That's true.
So, and I'm just wondering at times, into what point in time that parents would actually come into a realization to seek help.
Oh, I agree. I agree with that completely.
Instead of waiting until this child get into a space when they don't speak at all.
I agree.
Into a space of like psychosis,
I agree.
Seek help early.
Yep.
Before leaving it too late.
You know, Saane, the research, and I didn't want to make our conversation tonight too heavy from a medical or from a doctor perspective, right? But I just want to mention briefly about the observations that the child psychiatrists, the doctors make of children whose mother might be feeling anxious or depressed. Yep. So the evidence is that those children under the age of 5, those children are much more hyperactive. They're much more impulsive. They're much more, they don't do as well in social situations in terms of playing with other children. And as they start to learn, they don't learn, you know, their reading and their writing, it starts to fall behind. And they demonstrate levels of aggression that other children don't experience. And so, you know, at that young age, we're talking about children in that kindergarten age. If the mother is going through emotional difficulties, it does show up in the children. Yeah. And I think as you get to the school age, the primary school years, yeah, our children's behavior often reflects sometimes the well-being of the adults. And so we can't have a conversation about parenting without talking about, say, we need to talk about the effects that poverty has on parenting. We have to talk about the effects that cultural fragmentation has on parenting. You know, when we migrate, and the absence of grandparents, the absence of uncles and aunties, you know, sometimes the isolation of mothers and we can't have, we also have to have a conversation of what does the research show? The research shows that when children that are having children, so if you know, parenting for a teenage mother compared to a mum that's had 3 or 4 children and she's in her 30s, the parenting that a young child is going to receive is very different. If a young man and a woman, you know, bring children into the world and they haven't matured themselves. So yes, we can have a conversation about you know, an anxious child, but we shouldn't have that conversation in isolation for what we need to be able to understand what's going on for the parents in a wider context. And just bear that in mind as we have this conversation, because if we talk about, you know, a child being anxious or depressed and they're coming from a middle class Palangi family, or even a middle class Polynesian family, you know, where they've got a stable income, sound work, lots of support from friends and family, then I think some of the conversation we could have about how to help those children, it's much easier to help those children than it would be to help those children if all of those social supports and the financial security, if you take those things away, we need to have a conversation about what are the effects on parenting, what are the effects of poverty on parenting. You know, it's quite a deep conversation.
Yeah, that is very true. That's very true. So that's a conversation that will probably take to another level.
Yeah, that's true.
In terms of impact.
Can I say at this time? Can I say at this time that as a community, it's less about money and it's more about collective parenting. I think that one of the dangers for us is the notion of cultural fragmentation. If we all start that we've got a collective response to parenting. But my nervousness is that we start to see parents and the responsibility of parenting as just the responsibility of the biological father and the biological mother. I think the biggest risk to our community is we lose that sense of collective care, that we're in this together, and somehow, like, you think about Langima'a and the counseling support that you can provide for mums and dads, the support that an agency like yours can have in terms of its connections to resources that might help a family that is going through difficulty. Yeah, just something that I really truly believe in. Yeah,
which is very true. Because when we talked about poverty, it's not just about the materialistic things. That we so often define poverty in terms of like lack of finance, lack of resources. I'm not saying that they're not important.
Yes.
I'm saying that the greatest poverty that I've come across is actually our way of thinking that brings us spiral down, that spiral down in terms of life, in our way of thinking, in our, even within our belief system. So that's actually a harder probably concept to be able to untangle. Because some of it is actually intergenerational. But in saying that, it's not impossible. Because I remember when we first started our family, it's interesting to reflect back at the humble beginning. The humble beginning as a parent, when we didn't even have our own space, we have to come and stay at my sister-in-law's space, and forever grateful for her. And that's Lupe's mother for offering us a space to stay. And it's very interesting. And even raising our eldest son. I think Paluki was actually, his first ever McDonald's in his life was given to him by my husband's sister. Because we couldn't afford it, and we never gave him a McDonald's because we couldn't afford it. So it's a very interesting, but that was not something that worried me much in terms of that materialistic lacking. What was so important for me is for us parents to resource ourselves intellectually, emotionally, to be able to cope, and also to create wealth, to create the materialistic things that was lacking. So,
but do you know that your education, so for example, do you know that if you think about children that experience the worst childhood traumas, there are characteristics of the parents that we as a community should talk about, because we can keep an eye out for one another. Do you know, the younger that a mother is at the time that a child is born, her education that she's received, so limited education, often by having a partner that may not necessarily be the biological parent of the child, isolation from family supports, it's that type of, it's those factors that you can see are going to place a child at risk, but also that whole family at risk. So when we're talking about parenting, but I would love to be able to share with our community, keep an eye out for young couples that are isolated, that don't seem to have a significant social support. If they're your next door neighbor, or if they're in the family, I think there is a collective responsibility to the well-being of the children, but a collective responsibility to support those young parents. And even within our church community, there are, one of the things that we should talk about, Saane, is, and I didn't mention it earlier, but I should have, this notion of parental burnout. We don't talk about that. We talk about occupational burnout, teachers, police officers, nurses, working very hard and getting burnt out. But if those people are returning to homes where there are enormous personal demands, the well-being of the parent is as important, if not more important, than their parenting style, because you can only parent well if you're emotionally well enough to be able to and have the energy required to parent positively.
So that's actually bringing us into our last. We've already discussed it though. With our last question for this evening, Siale, what do we think that we should do as a community in supporting each other in this parenting journey?
I've always believed this, and I've said it many times, when I've been asked to speak at conferences, Saane, and to present my views to the Ministry of Health and other Crown agencies. They've always asked me, Dr. Siale, if you could focus on one aspect of mental health that would improve the well-being of our community, I truly believe this. We should put our resources and time into mothers and babies. Do you know, if we could give the children, if we could support the mothers to be emotionally available, emotionally reliable, emotionally consistent, and enjoy the gift of being a mother, And I guess this applies to fathers too, but mainly on mums, because they're 95% the primary caregiver. Yeah, unless, something happens to them, they can't care. But the majority of them, and it's in that space, if we could support mums so that they could have the time, effort, and energy. And if you think about what happens in our Tongan situation back home, and you think about our cultural paradigm of the care for a mother that's pregnant, and the responsibility of the mother's brothers towards the newborn child. We have these rituals that mean that the mother's cared for well. And I think that, and that responsibility of caring is given to the sisters and the cousins and the older children. Everybody parents the child. And I think, that would be my final comment, Saane, is to not forget our cultural paradigm of the care that we gave. And if, as a community, if we could focus our efforts on mothers and babies so that their children got a good early start and was cared for well by a mother that was emotionally well, it would make a significant difference to the trajectory of the children as they age into adolescence, into young men and women, and into their adult lives.
Okay. Thank you, Siale. And that's a very valid comment that you're saying. And while you're actually explaining about the collective parenting, in what way, Robbie asked the question, in what way that people of the community and the wider relative being able to support a mother to provide the best, to be emotionally stable, emotionally well, because, I've always have a say that out of our heart springs the living water. And if we're able to nurture this living water, then it's coming out of the heart of every mother that is giving birth to a child. This child will drink of that spring of living water. In a time where every process of nurturing in their lives, it's needed in every way. And like what you said, it will save us a lot of headache and heartache in the long run of parenting.
It's true.
So that's actually bring us into a closure, Siale, this evening. Was there any last or final comment before we close?
I just want to thank you, Saane and Langima'a, for the good work that you do. I'm hoping that these series of conversations you're going to have with people that might share something of some value for our community. I think that's so important, and it's just an ongoing resource using technology that people can come and visit your site and look at these conversations. So thank you to you and the organization, and to the sponsor of our conversation tonight.
Malo apito Siale, and thank you for everyone that is watching us live at the moment, and also will be watching us probably later on. We just want to say thank you for your time and listening. It's worth listening out and learned the lessons and the insights that has been discussed tonight. So could we please say a word of prayer? Yeah. Loving and gracious God, we just want to say thank you. Thank you for all the mistakes that we made in our lives, that we look back and we learned from them. And we thank you, oh Lord, for the insights that you continue to teach us on the way. We do pray for your blessings on each and every one of us in the way we parent our children during this lockdown and this pandemic. We do pray for your guidance, for your peace and your blessings. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Awesome.
Malo apito Siale mawhainga mali.
Yeah.